that have seen me give a talk like this before, it's going to be very, very similar. Typical layout of the slides. I'm going to hit on just parts of the data, yield, protein, some of the more important diseases. But you can get all of the details if you go to this website, and that'll get you to a PDF file that shows all the data that I'll be presenting today. So this is put together in conjunction with Jochen Wiersma, who's very integral in our variety testing program. So first we're review releases from our program going back for the last few years. So Linker has been it was the #1 variety in the state for a 5-year period and was finally supplanted by a Westbred variety in 2021. Still has about 12% of the acres. Bowles released in 2015, Shelley, Lang MN, Washburn is still holding in there. But our newest release, MN Torgey, named after Dave Torgeson, who's in the audience today, got off to a very good start. That's a very, very high percentage of the state's acreage for its first real year of production. Before that, it was seed increases. And it had a good year, so we're anticipating a jump in acreage for 2022 for Torgey. And we do have a candidate for release for this year that I will be presenting here near the end, and I'll show you some of its data. So here's the variety survey results. This is from a Minnesota Association of Wheat Growers survey that goes out. It's either online or a postcard survey, so if you fill that out, thank you. I think it's very valuable information. So as you can see, this Westbred 9590 was #1 in 2021, followed by Balda, Linker, another Westbred variety, and then here's Torgey with a nice percentage there for 2021. So I always like to look at these trends, kind of see what is being grown, because that helps us target our new releases and our breeding program to kind of supplant those eventually with better varieties. So it really tells me what traits are important to you guys growers, because we're testing all of these guys, so we know a lot about them and their comparative performance. I'd like to see Mayville is finally dropping away, very scab susceptible variety, but we do have some other scab susceptible ones in there, and I'll be pointing those out here as we go along. As usual, we had a lot of new releases or varieties that we tested for the first time in Minnesota this last year. So a couple from AgriPro, both Gunsmoke and AP Smith. We had both of those as experimental lines in 2020, so you'll see 2-year data presented for those. CAG, these are new varieties, so I think they're new to the wheat business. 3 from Cropland by Winfield. Peterson Farm Seeds has a new one, so we've never had an entry from them before. And Meridian Seeds has Cobra. Unfortunately, we don't have as good a data on these new varieties as we normally would because of the growing conditions. It was very hot, very dry, so we had no lodging in any of our trials, so that's a first in my 23 years. So we have no lodging data from our trials on these varieties, and we saw no bacterial leaf streak. That's a disease where we need some moisture, we need humidity, and we just didn't have the moisture to produce that disease this year. So we're going to be flying blind here on these guys. So normally I don't talk about heading date. I know you guys are looking at flowering time and maturity dates when you select your varieties. So I kind of let you do that on your own. But I did want to point out this year that there's getting to be quite a range in heading date of our spring wheat varieties. Barracuda, Cannon is a very early one, but we're getting some very late ones. So if you thought Trigger was late, there's things that are even later than Trigger now. And for all of these slides, I've got 20 or 21 releases in bold. So look for that bold black. Those are the newer varieties, which everybody's always interested in seeing where they sort out. And I'll just kind of give you a hint now. All of these varieties did very well yield-wise in 2021. And I did a correlation between heading date and yield. The later heading dates are tending to yield better. That correlation was 0.52. That's probably the highest number I've ever seen in my 23 years. I went back and looked at last year, that correlation was 0.25. And I think most growers really don't like later wheats. You want it to finish early, get it out of the field, maybe spread that risk a little bit, have different maturities out there. But just a word of warning that we are getting some that are rather late, and those later ones did well in 2021. They may not necessarily be the best yielders in a more normal year, where we're not as hot or as dry. All right, here's the yields. A lot of numbers on here. Green is the highest values, the red is the lowest value, so essentially a reverse heat map, and you can see which ones we've tested in just 2021. Those are those new ones, and which ones we've got as 2 or 3 year varieties. So there's a lot of bold ones there, so I think these varieties are getting released and put out there because of their yield, and I think I can point out some deficiencies of them as we go along. A lot of them tend to be lower protein, and a lot of those guys are later heading. So. Protein. So if you were in the previous session, Jim Peterson from North Dakota Wheat Commission talked about the need for quality. You may not always see it in the price at the elevator, but it's sort of already built into the price of hard red spring wheat. It is the premium wheat on the world market. So you're getting a premium already relative to hard red winter wheat and some of the other wheats that are out there, because the market is expecting it to have this quality. It's expecting at least a 14.5% protein. And this baking quality column, 1 is good, 9 is bad. That's taking into account the gluten strength, the dough strength, how good a loaf volume it makes, water absorption, how much water that dough can take up. All of those are figured in there. So we've got, I think, a growing range of protein contents. Also, there's always a few. There's kind of 1 or 2 oddballs that are really low. Now we've got some of these new ones. They're later, they're higher yielding, yeah, but they're pretty darn low protein also. I don't have quality data on these guys yet, but I'm expecting. I'd be surprised if they're higher than a 6. They're probably going to be in that 7 range, because it's really hard to get that functional quality at a protein level that's that low. Here's a graph I always do, plotting protein versus yield. So we've got yield in bushel per acre using our northern locations for the last 2 years on the x-axis, protein on the y-axis. Of course, we all want something in this upper right-hand quadrant. There's never anything there. So we've had a few get close over the years, but it's just physiologically very difficult to do. So if you want the highest yield, you're probably going to be on the lower protein side. I've highlighted where the Minnesota releases come out here. They tend to be higher than average protein, lower than average yield. I think some of the success that we're seeing with Torghi is it's getting closer into that upper quadrant. It's above average yielder, but it's also above average in protein. And I've highlighted in purple some of those more popular varieties. So here, Valda is still holding its own on yield. The West bred varieties, good protein, good quality. In our small plot trials, they tend to be on the lower yield side. And AP Murdoch, there's quite a bit of acreage of it this last year, but it had a very poor year yield-wise. So Murdoch really stuck out to me because it was looking really good the last 2 years, and it did not like 2021 conditions. And I went back, I said that's got to be a mistake. And I looked at all of our individual locations, and pretty much every location, it was the same story. Relative performance in 2021 was not as good as 2020 or 2019. And when the Prairie Grains magazine came out, I looked at South Dakota's data, private company data, they're showing the same thing. So Murdoch, it's probably a heat thing, but Murdoch is one that just did not like 2020. So if you've got seed of that, hopefully we get back to a more normal year for the sake of that. All right, straw strength. Again, all of these new ones, I can't say a darn thing because everything stood in 2021. Some other newer varieties, new name varieties where we had data from last year, I can it's going to be a 4 or a 5. We need a little bit more data to know for sure. AP Smith is pretty good. It looks right up there with Linker. That really looks really nice standing in the field. So a lot of good choices, I think, in this 2 to 3 and 4 area there. Diseases, Fusarium head blight, continue to put a lot of emphasis in our program on this. I know most of you are putting on fungicide. You didn't have to last year, but most years that fungicide is paying off. Even on a more resistant variety, that you can have some benefit there. So the 3s and the 4s are things that I would call moderately resistant, trying to push you into those varieties as much as possible. So, essentially half of the varieties that are available, we would consider moderately resistant. So good choices. Really want to stay away from the 7s for sure, and I would try to push you away from the 6s also. Try to find a variety that has some of those characteristics that you're looking for without as much risk for scab. Certainly you could get away with it in 2021, but if we get back to a scab epidemic type of year, there's certainly extra risk there. Bacterial leaf streak is the other disease. This one, there's really no other control options available that we know of. There's no chemical that really works, crop rotation. We're just at the mercy of Mother Nature, and if we have high temperatures, high humidity, high moisture, that's when we see this disease. And again, with these newer ones, we're flying blind because we don't have that information. Torgie's good. Froberg, a new one from North Dakota, is good. The ones that are 6 or higher, again, they're going to be a little bit more on the risky side. And probably most everybody in this room has seen what bacterial leaf streak can do. It'll turn your leaves brown, and you'll feel it in the yield and probably the test weight. The last trait that I'm going to mention is pre-harvest sprouting. This was the big topic in 2019. Got burned by it pretty good with some of our varieties. We have most of the varieties are rated as 1 or 2. You shouldn't have any problems with those. The 3 or 4, that's when we start to see some sprouting issues and the low falling numbers. And in 2019, we actually saw some falling number issues with the varieties that I've got indicated. I don't have them indicated with an asterisk here. Oh yeah, I do. So there's a few with the asterisk behind them. Those had lower falling numbers than we were expecting based on the pre-harvest sprouting. And it could be a little different genetic system controlling those 2 traits. If you do have sprouting, you will have low falling number, but there's some varieties that genetically will give a low falling number even if there's no evidence of sprouting. So those are the ones with the asterisk where you have to be aware of that situation. All right, finally the picks. I'm being very objective here, not a lot of subjectivity. Basically went through all these traits and said, what have we tested for 3 years? It's a 5 or less for FHB or BLS, a 1 or a 2 for PHS, and 6 or less for quality. And basically, this is all that you're left with. I think Bowls would qualify here also, but that's an older variety, and I think it's seen its peak, and it's not probably coming back. So there's still a pretty good list to choose from. Some that are maybe a little bit surprising. You don't have a lot of the higher yielding group in here. Valda's probably the only one, and Torgi are probably the highest yielders in this group. But there's maybe some that you hadn't considered. McLeod is kind of a nice steady variety. Linkert's still in there because of that straw strength, and there's still a fair amount of acreage for it. A little weaker on scab. So some varieties maybe to have a look at that you hadn't been considering if you're very focused on the yield side of things. All right, here's our release candidates. So our crop variety review committee is meeting on Monday morning, so we would have a decision then, or a recommendation to the associate experiment station director, and then the official release would be sometime in January if it's approved. So this is MN 15005-4. It's got some Prosper, a Minnesota line, and Norton as the pedigree. The main thing that we're looking at here is this straw strength paired with the good yield. So it's up there with Torgi, actually a little bit higher than Torgi in yield, but better straw strength. I'm not quite ready to say that it's straw strength equivalent to Linkert. I wanted one more good year of data on the straw strength. We didn't get that, so I'm kind of waffling, saying it's between a 2 and a 3. But these guys are in order of yield, so it's going to be the highest straw strength in this high yield group, at least the popular varieties. And that's what I'm comparing it to here is the popular varieties. Other characteristics, kind of average, or a little bit later on heading, medium height, test weight's okay, protein is average, a little better than a lot of the other higher yielding varieties. Baking quality is okay, pre-harvest sprouting is okay, it's a 2. Bacterial leaf streak and scab. I think that scab might be a 4. Hopefully it's a 4. So not a breakthrough in disease resistance, but I think it's good enough. So yield and straw strength, and I think that would sell some seed, and that's why I'm recommending it for a release. All right. So I do have a few more slides after this, but I want to acknowledge all of the folks. So these are folks on my project. Emmanuel's a grad student. He has left now, but it takes a lot of people to run all these trials and the disease trials and everything. So big thanks to all of those folks. So let's see how I'm doing. All right. Oh, mention our funding. Basically three groups where most of our funding is coming from. First, the Wheat Research and Promotion Council, U.S. Wheat and Barley Scab Initiative, and the Small Grains Initiative. Those are kind of our 3 biggest buckets of funding for our project. All right, so I just want to roll through a couple of slides to kind of put a wrapper on this MDA funded project we did. I talked about this, I think, each of the last 2 years at this event. So we have some real results to show now. And if we have time later, Melissa will be showing a video that kind of summarizes some of this information as well. So we're trying to get at anti-nutrient factors related to wheat digestibility. And here's kind of the issue. Per capita wheat consumption has been going down for a while. And we know it's linked to people avoiding wheat, avoiding gluten. Some of this is certainly legitimate. If you have celiac disease, you really can't tolerate any gluten. There's wheat allergies, but then there's non-allergy or non-celiac wheat sensitivity. So is that the gluten? Is that some other component? And it's estimated at around 15% of the population. So I'm almost positive that there's going to be several in the room that are probably restricting your intake of wheat or avoiding wheat because it gives you a bellyache or some gastrointestinal issues. Well, we wanted to get to the bottom of that, and there's other things other than gluten that could be the cause, and that's what we're trying to investigate here. So there's the FODMAP, so some of the starches and sugars that are in the wheat kernel, and ATIs, amylase trypsin inhibitors. That's an anti-nutrient factor. It's probably has something to do with the defense mechanisms of the wheat to prevent predation by insects or something. So we wanted to look at the levels of these and see has it changed over time, and can we do different processing techniques for the wheat to bring those down. So objectives: characterize the variation and look at the genetics of those traits. Take a look at fermentation as a technique to reduce the amounts of those traits. And then finally establish a pathway to implement the research results. So I'm going to roll through these fairly quickly. So we had a large panel of wheats. We had heritage wheats that were released before 1970, modern wheats, durum, ancient wheats, and einkorns and emmers, synthetic hexaploid, which is kind of crossing the ancient wheats together, essentially. So a lot of variation. And then we did DNA markers on them, and basically we're separating the lines in two directions, X and Y axes, based on how closely related they are. Here's our modern lines. They're fairly distant from the heritage or the founder lines, which you would expect. And then introductions in our programs over the years. A lot of Chinese germplasm that gave us the scab resistance. Mexican stuff that came in the 1970s, I think helped give us some yield, broad adaptation, some different flowering time genes were brought in with that material. All right, here's the main results. The FODMAPs in percent of constituent of that grain is ranging from about 0.3 to 1.2, or about a 3x variation, so we're seeing variation there. The ATIs, we're seeing about more than 2x variation there. So as a plant breeder, this is good. We have variation, so if we want to start breeding for lower values, we have the genetic material to do so. The target value for the FODMAPs is probably around 0.3. If we could get less than 0.3%, it's like, yeah, this is something that would be good. So almost all of the varieties are higher than that. So we've got some work to do, but I think we could get there. Here's the biggest moment for me is when I put this graph together. Has the breeding per se changed the amount of FODMAPs or ATIs in the wheat over time? And the answer is no. If anything, we're maybe trending a little bit lower in FODMAPs. So that was my biggest fear, was this was going to show that, you know, the wheat today has 2 or 3 times the FODMAPs of Thatcher wheat from the 1930s. Then it's like, oh boy, this is maybe our fault. And it would be inadvertent. We're not trying to breed for this. This is the first time we've ever looked at it. So this is good news. ATIs, maybe it's trending upward a little bit, but there's an upward bias in this assay with grain protein. And we've had some higher protein releases recently, so I think that's why this is going up a little bit. So we need to correct for that in the assay. But I think we're probably off the hook here as well. So if it's really ATI and FODMAPs that are causing these wheat sensitivity issues, I don't think we can pin it on the genetics. I think it's more on the processing. So what's changed in processing of wheat in the last 50, 60 years? Well, one thing that was lost was sourdough fermentation. So Brian LaPlante with Back When Foods took our wheat samples, different FODMAP and ATI levels, put them through sourdough fermentation, and lo and behold, that simple process reduces the ATIs down quite a bit. And with FODMAPs, it was fairly dramatic as well. The FODMAPs themselves went up, but these polyols are a constituent of the FODMAPs, and they will essentially get baked off in the baking process. So this is analyzing the dough, not the final process. And keep in mind, this was all done during COVID, so we had to cut some corners. But if we had to do it over again, we'd probably measure this in the bread to know for sure. So this fructan, that's really the one to follow, I think, as a measure of what FODMAPs overall are doing, and they're dropping dramatically with processing. So the bottom line here is probably the processing end is where we can have the greatest impact. Maybe we can do something on the breeding side as well, but it's going to take some effort, and will that rise as a high enough priority level for us to keep going that direction? So to quickly summarize, we saw wide differences in these FODMAPs and ATIs. I didn't have it on the graphs, but these einkorns and emmers were both low in FODMAPs as well. So that could be another reservoir of genetic variation that we could tap. Or if you're growing an ancient grain, that's maybe a marketing tool that you could use, is that they're low in these anti-nutrient traits. And I didn't show any data, but we're not finding any major genes for these traits, so it's going to be kind of a slow and steady breeding process to get us where we want to be. But again, I think the fermentation is probably the biggest takeaway, that the processing can help. And the background on going after these FODMAPs, ATIs, there's quite a bit of literature on that this is probably part of the issue, and maybe more of an issue than the actual gluten per se. So we're not the first ones to discover this or start working on this, but this is the first time that it had been looked at in the spring wheat germplasm. So acknowledging all the folks here. So George Honor was the main person at U of M working on it. Ori was very instrumental in organizing all of this, and Charlie and also with Minnesota as well. So I will stop there. Take questions on this project or anything on wheat varieties. Great.
Jim, I did want to ask you about the BLS ratings. When we look at your data, I'm with 21st Century Genetics. We get virtually the same ratings you have, but we take it another step and we get the yield. And we have varieties that will show the damage of the leaf, but they handle it much, much better. They're at the top for yield. And what we see is that the disease does not progress. It doesn't get in the head. Getting in the head is a real killer with that disease. And so, and I've worked with, what's her name again? But anyway, the group, Ruth Del Mackey. And so we do both, and there are these varieties, and the term I use is they have a good coping reaction. And the one of them is a new release, Wildcat. But my comment is, you might think about looking at doing a little bit of yield, even if it's just a little bit, just get an idea of how they're coping with that. And I'll add one other thing. No, I won't. That's all I really want to ask you, Joe.
Okay. Yeah. So that's something. If I get a really severe trial and there's a good spread, I'll look at that correlation between yield and BLS. Usually it's pretty good, but I'll try to see if I can spot some outliers. And it's a lot of sometimes we're getting that data off of single rows, not the whole plot. So if we're doing a single row study, then the yield isn't very valuable. There's too much error associated with it.